Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Reports suggest that India has quietly agreed to cut back purchases of Russian oil, a move that could squeeze Moscow's war finances and reshape global energy flows. President Donald Trump says India assured him it would not be buying oil from Russia, although New Delhi hasn't confirmed this yet, with Russia still earning 550 million euros a day from energy exports. The question is, could this shift finally weaken the Kremlin's war machine? Well, joining me is Jakub Kapishevsky. He's our business editor at TVP World. Kuba, great to have you back.
Great to be here.
Welcome. So before we kick off, short soundbite. President Donald Trump had this to say.
We were not happy with him buying oil from Russia because that lets Russia continue on with this ridiculous war where they've lost 1.5 million people. By the way, Russia's lost 1.5 million people, soldiers mostly. This is a war that should have never started, but it's a war that Russia should have won in the first week, and they're going into the fourth year. And I want to see it stop. So I was not happy that India was buying oil. And he assured me today that they will not be buying oil from Russia. That's a big stop.
Right. So we haven't had confirmation from India yet. How credible is what President Trump is saying?
And that's a very good question, because 20 minutes ago, BBC ran a story when they rang the spokesperson of the Indian government, and he said that he's not aware of any phone conversation the Indian leader had with President Donald Trump. So, of course, it's a big question whether Trump jumped the shark and whether they actually had this call, or is it only a diplomatic/negotiation tactic on Trump's part? Because Washington has been putting pressure on India to stop or decrease the flow of Russian oil into the country for many weeks now, starting in August with punitive tariffs for doing just this thing.
Exactly.
So maybe this is just another stage in this pressure campaign to force Indians' hands and to tell them, listen, guys, you really need to decrease the flow of Russian oil into your refineries.
It's putting Prime Minister Modi in a position where he can't really say, oh, no, we haven't agreed to this.
Exactly. And I think Modi played this pretty well, because throughout those weeks when Washington pressured India, there was no official statement by him. We've heard experts saying India won't be pushed around. Mm-hmm. India cannot switch suppliers on a very short notice just like that. We've heard experts saying like that, but not the Prime Minister himself.
Right.
So I think this is a kind of a strategic ambiguity on his part. He's not saying no, he's not saying yes. Let's see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you see, the interesting thing is with India that when the full-scale invasion started in 2022, at that point, India was buying none of its gas resources, oil resources from Russia. It's now getting 40% of those resources.
Absolutely,
from
it's
Russia.
A massive switch, huge switch on a scale replicated, I think, only in Poland, because we also used to source 40% of our oil from Russia, even more, and then we switched. Maybe not overnight, but basically overnight. We switched from Russia to Saudi Arabia, even before the war started. However, those guys, they've been getting a massive discount, because for Russia to be able to move its crude on the global market, it has to sell it at a price slightly lower than the average market price of oil. And for some countries, this is an opportunity very hard to pass on.
Right.
So that's why they were hoovering up this oil, in turn just changing this price difference into their profit. Right?
Yeah, and not only that, of course, the thing is that we're paying lower prices for oil and gas for India means lower inflation, which, of course, for internal diplomacy and so on and politics,
of course,
that makes sense.
There is the strong disinflationary impulse that cheap oil gives you, right?
Okay, so what do you think is going to, given all of this, it's cheap oil, it reduces inflation in India, what's going to make Modi change his mind? I mean, it's a big country. India's a big country. He doesn't have to do what Trump says. Do you think he will really switch?
It's very hard to tell. Well, on one thing, they are saying it's not easy to switch from such one massive supplier to a couple of smaller ones. But you said yourself, like before the war, just 4 years ago, they were buying zero oil from Russia. And now they are buying 40%. So if they were able to ramp up so massively purchases of Russian oil, they can decrease. I'm not saying that that even on a shorter time scale. And we had people on this very station when we interviewed them telling us that it's absolutely logistically possible to just make this switch. Maybe not from 40 to zero, but from 40 to 20 in a space of a couple of months, even a year.
Right. So in that trajectory, they can move quite quickly. Well, clearly, they moved quite quickly, getting it up to 40%.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why they can't do it in reverse. Now, Russia's still making 550 million euros a day from its oil and gas exports. Even if India does do this, does pull out, how much of a difference is that going to make to Russia's capacity to wage war?
Well, of course, the question is, let's assume Indians stop buying. What happens with this oil that was destined for India? Is it going to find other purchases? Because if it does, well, the net effect on Russian income stays the same. But let's just say they stop buying. No one wants this oil. It's bad oil, right? So it will slightly decrease this revenue, maybe by 50 or 100 even million dollars a day. But we have to remember that there are still other purchases, even bigger than India, by which I mean China. And China has been mentioned by Washington, maybe hasn't been singled out as much as India has been by Washington politicians and Donald Trump himself. But China has been singled out, for example, by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, as a country that buys even more oil, and they also buy a lot of Russian gas. Right. So Russia sells a lot of this stuff. So you have to approach this gradually. So at the beginning of the war, they were making around 1.2 billion a day selling energy on a global market. Right now, as you said, 550 million. So we brought it down to around 60%, halved it. So it's a gradual process. And we should just build on this momentum. And I think that's why Trump is trying to apply the pressure, because this 560 figure, 550, 600, it has been stable for over a year now.
Yep. Okay, now you mentioned China, and I do want to talk about China in just a second. But before we go there, the other thing, of course, that we've seen over the period of this war is the use of drones. Drone technology. And of course, drones don't use the level of fuel that tanks do and trucks, military trucks and so on. I mean, could it be that with this shift towards less reliance for waging war, less reliance on fuel, that Russia actually could continue its escalation or escalate its attack on Ukraine indefinitely?
Absolutely, because this brings us to a different story. So Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries. So these already have knocked out around 13 to 15% of Russia crude processing capability. And we've seen lines to petrol stations throughout Russia. However, the fact that a civilian, individual, ordinary Russian cannot buy oil, cannot buy diesel or gasoline, doesn't mean that the military doesn't have access to it. And the military doesn't need as much gasoline as it used to, because it's not an armor war anymore. It's a drone war, as you said.
Right.
However, so this is one aspect of it. They have enough fuel to fuel their forces. So the big game right now is taking away the cash they are using to pay for this war effort, right? So it's not the technology you're using, technology they are using, technology that is mainly used to fuel this war, which is drones, made fuel supply maybe not obsolete, but less important than it used to be.
Yeah, less important as part of the mix in terms of funding their economy and the war. Now, India has always been non-aligned. It's always bought stuff from both, what was the Soviet Union and the West, and it's kind of been very firm in that. How do you think, if India were to pull out of buying from Russia, how do you think that might affect its relationship with Russia going forward?
I'm not sure it's going to be like a detrimental to the relationship, because buying energy from Russia, or buying oil from Russia, isn't the only thing that makes this relationship work, because they are also sourcing arms in Russia, and they are buying a lot of this. And every time one country sells another country like a weapon system, it means that you gain a foothold in this country that you've sold the weapon system to for 20, 30 years, because you have to source it, you have to exchange parts, you have to provide training for the military. So every time you sell a weapon system, whether it be a fighter or an armored tank or whatever, artillery system, anti-air defense, whatever, you gain a foothold in this country. And Russians also sell other kinds of energy, so to speak, by which I mean technology for civilian, nuclear, electricity. And this also gives you a very powerful foothold in the country, because a nuclear power plant is going to run for 50, 60, maybe even 70 years.
Right.
And they are going to need, the country that you sold the technology to, they are going to need your expertise for the next 50 or 60 years.
For maintenance and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even if they say, listen, guys, we are not buying your crude anymore, excuse me, like there's this gentleman in Washington, he's very nasty to us, like we have to really keep this down, they are still going to have moderately good relationship with Russia because they do a lot of business with them.
Okay, now let's get to to China now, and we have a graph which shows that essentially what India buys is about 2/3 of what China buys in total from Russia. In terms of India pulling out, is that going to make a difference? You mentioned that there might be a surplus of oil that Russia needs to sell. Surely China could take up that surplus, couldn't it?
I think they could, some of it, if they were offered a good price, because they are very good businessmen, right? And
right.
On this graph, we also see a reason. China is also buying Russian crude because it also gets a discount. So it's not that India is the only country getting the discount. Every country is getting the discount, and we have the same problem in Europe, because EU is the 4th largest buyer of Russian energy. According to this graph, we have the same problem in Europe with Hungary and Slovakia, very keen on still buying Russian crude because they receive a discount, and this discount they translate into profit of their petroleum refineries. Right. So Chinese could scoop up some of this crude, and the rest of it maybe could find buyers all over the world.
In Turkey, in the European Union,
absolutely.
South Korea.
Absolutely. It could be scooped up by a company that acts as an intermediary in the process. So it just buys Russian oil from India that the India doesn't want anymore, and then it just sells to another country. But in a transaction log, so to speak, it's going to be shown up not as a transaction going from country to country, but from country to private business.
Right.
And it can change hands many times. It can be stored somewhere and wait for better days.
Yeah. Very difficult to identify its source after a while. We've got another soundbite coming up. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury. Let's have a listen to what he has to say.
Again, it is the purchase of Russian oil by China that fuels the Russian war machine. China buys 60% of Russian energy. They buy 90% of Iranian energy. So who is fueling the Russian war machine?
Well, see, now this is a huge question to my mind. I'd like your view on it. China's really responsible for funding the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. China is the one that's buying from Iran. 90% of Iran's output is bought by China. And yet, sanctions to China never seem to materialize. I mean, they materialized on India, but not China. What's going on?
I think that's just because, like, between Washington and Beijing, you have like a whole catalog of issues, and Washington tries to prioritize. So for them, getting the trade deficit down, number one priority, getting some extra cash in the form of tariffs. So by essentially forcing China to pay for access to the American market, this was like the issue number one and issue number two for them. And Ukraine, as you probably know, because you've been following the news and you've been talking about the news on this very program and in this very TV station, Donald Trump gave China some leeway, so to speak, and he gave Russia some leeway. And because he gave Russia some leeway on Ukraine, Ukraine wasn't the priority number one for this administration from the get-go. it seems like now the priorities may be shifting a little bit after the Gaza ceasefire. We may see a great return of Trump, the deal maker. Maybe he will shift his attention again towards Ukraine. Tomorrow he's meeting with Zelensky in Washington. Maybe there's going to be some big announcement. We all know how the last meeting went.
Yep.
It didn't went very well. It didn't help Ukrainian issue in Washington. So when Americans were putting pressure on China, they weren't singling out the Ukraine issue or the war issue, because they had like a whole catalog of other stuff. Rare earth metals, like the newest issue from the last week, and actually the soundbite, if we heard like a bigger version of it, Bessent was firstly talking about rare earth metals. And only then he turned to Ukraine/Russia war and China buying Russian crude and therefore fueling Russian war machine. So I think only now, when they have settled a couple of issues with China, not all of them, by no means all of them, they like turn a little bit toward this another part of the great geopolitical puzzle, which is constant flow of money from Beijing to Russia for energy supply.
Right. Okay. So perfectly clear how, as you've laid it out. But here's my question: Trump has said to Europe, to Brussels, the EU, look, stop buying Russian oil, stop funding this war, etc. Well, China's doing it. So isn't there a disparity between the way Trump is behaving towards the European Union and the way he's behaving towards China, right? And yes, of course, there's a whole list of issues with China, but does China have too many cards to play such that Trump is powerless?
Well, yes, they do. And the rare earths we mentioned 2 minutes ago.
Investments in Europe.
Investments in Europe. But the rare earths issue is very, very painful, or maybe let me rephrase that. Potentially could be very painful for high-tech businesses that are actually using products based on those elements, this small catalog of 20 plus elements that go into this category of rare earths. And with China controlling 70% of global extraction and, what's even more important, refining of those elements, because you have to refine them to actually use them in products, well, China holds all the cards.
Right. Okay, do you think, and here's an optimistic viewpoint, I'm not sure I subscribe to it, but I'd like your thoughts. Do you think that the risk of the imposition of very high tariffs and so on, and other sanctions on China might actually bring China to the table and some kind of compromise be hashed out?
I think Chinese may agree to lowering the purchases, because previously you said that India has been very smart when it comes to sourcing all sorts of stuff, that they always try to have a couple of suppliers. China has the same strategy, and you can see it with natural gas. Like, we saw this graph and we see how much natural gas China is buying from Russia, but actually they buy more from Central Asian countries. And they even built a very special pipeline that bypasses Russia completely and uses only gas source from Central Asian countries. So China may be open to lower their supply of Russian crude because, first, of this diversification strategy. Oh, here we go with the graph again. They're very okay with diversification strategy when it comes to strategic stuff like oil and natural gas. But also, there is the newest forecast by International Energy Agency. And the agency says that next year we're going to have a supply glut of oil. So this means that supply outstrips demand. So Chinese authorities may probably think, okay, if we decrease the shipments of oil from Russia, we can buy the stuff from another country because there's already too much of it. Yeah, anyway, because there's already too much of the stuff in the market. Yeah. And maybe Scott Bessent and Donald Trump also see those forecasts. They have even their own energy information agency, like their own agency, which also makes those forecasts. And they may think, well, this is a very good moment to pressure India. Yeah. And maybe to start pressuring China on this, because we have this very favorable global environment when there's already too much oil. Because we all have to remember, after the war started, when Joe Biden was the US president, actually we were scared that if we take off all supply of Russian crude from global oil market, the price will increase exponentially.
Yep.
And we had trouble with inflation already because of the aftershocks of the pandemic and whatever. So this was the main scare, oil scare. We take Russian crude off the table, prices are going to shoot up,
Yep.
inflation is going to shoot up, we cannot do this. That's why you had this G7 price cap, basically a mechanism which allows Russia to sell, but at a lowered price.
Right.
But now, environment is changing.
Completely different set-
Everybody is pumping much more
Yeah,
than
yeah,
they used to.
yeah.
There will be an oil glut. It changes the constellation. I'm not sure whether it changes it profoundly, but it changes it a lot. So there's a lot of there's going to be a lot happening in this area.
Well, as there always is, isn't there, Kuba? In the last few seconds that we have left, Turkey. No, I've just been told we don't have even a few seconds.
But Turkey is still buying.
Turkey's
They are
still buying, yes, and they will probably keep buying. Kuba, as always, thank you so much for joining. It was so much fun, as always. Thank
As
you.
always, thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.